La Constitution est suspendue jusqu'à nouvel ordre.
When you turn on your TV at midnight and see the military on the airwaves, it's either a declaration of war or very bad news for a sitting president, because it usually means a coup d'etat is underway. This is from Zimbabwe, where the 30-plus year rule of strongman Robert Mugabe was under siege in an apparent coup.
As soon as we have accomplished our mission, we expect that the situation will return to normalcy.
Coups tend to happen in less stable pockets of the world, and they come in different varieties. Maybe a regime is toppled at the barrel of a gun, or maybe it's a cordial escort out of the presidential palace. In most cases, the coup leaders get the ball rolling by taking over state media airwaves. It's the easiest way to convince the public and other military members that they have control of the country, even if they don't. In the volatile fog of a coup attempt, perception is reality. Not all experts agree on the criteria or even what to call certain types of coups, but there are some reoccurring themes. The most common type is a military coup. Take Pakistan in 1999. The prime minister fires the head of the army, General Pervez Musharraf. Just hours later, the army strikes back in a swift, bloodless coup. Troops surround the prime minister's home, close all the major airports, and take over state-run media.
I have faith in the destiny of this nation.
Then there's the palace coup. This is what happens when a member of the political elite who's not in the military but has their support seizes power. Let's go to Qatar in June 1995. That's when the country's crown prince Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani decided to depose his own father. Now, there are times when a government pretends there's a coup attempt as a pretext to better keep its citizens in line, or to prolong its grip on power. This is sometimes called a fake coup. In February 2010, a Turkish newspaper published a story about a possible military coup. The alleged masterminds were detained. Today, most think the story was built on fabricated evidence, but this so-called coup allowed Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan to consolidate his power. A coup isn't always an inside job. A foreign intervention coup usually has a little help. Take Iran in 1953. U.S. government documents show that the CIA orchestrated the coup that toppled the country's prime minister. Then there's the self-coup. In April 1992, Peru's President Alberto Fujimori went on TV to announce that he was dissolving Congress, suspending civil liberties, and establishing a government by decree. He stayed in power for another 8 years.
Pleasure to welcome you to the Newseum for the latest edition of Times Talks DC. A special welcome as well to the national and international audience viewing us online. We're thrilled to bring our signature Times Talks live event series to Washington for a series of in-depth conversations with New York Times journalists exploring the most pressing issues of the day. Special thanks to our hosts at the Newseum and to AARP for sponsoring tonight's event. Tonight, our focus is on bipartisanship and whether meaningful collaboration between the two parties is still possible. We're delighted to be joined by two senators and friends who have been collaborating on banking and budget issues for years and who will candidly assess the reasons behind the dissolution of compromise in American politics. Here to interview them is someone who knows our two special guests and their world quite well, a former New York Times congressional correspondent, now editor for live journalism in D.C. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Jennifer Steinauer, and our special guests, Senators Bob Corker and Mark Warner.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Senators. Thank you for coming tonight.
Good to be with you.
We are going to visit for about 50 minutes together. So kind of like I'm seeing you in the Senate subway, but the doors are shut and you're trapped for 15 minutes with me. And then after that, we'll take some questions, both from our live audience here and from Facebook Live, from the New York Times. So let's get into it. So we kind of take it as an article of faith that bipartisanship is good. Polling says we want people to work across the aisle. This is a good thing. We like bipartisan bills. But when we get into the nitty-gritty of governing, that's not really always the case, even that it's has a positive connotation. I know when Democrats were in charge, Republicans would say, well, we don't want to give them any victories. It's too close to an election year. And when the tables turned, Republicans were in charge, and they don't want to help with Democrats either. They don't want to help each other, even do simple things, pass simple bills together. So I think we have to start from asking the question, can it happen, and is there any point to bipartisanship anymore? What function does it serve? Senator Corker, would you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, bipartisanship means that when you pass a piece of legislation, it will stand the test of time. When one party passes a piece of legislation without the support of the other party, when they're in power, immediately begins to try to unwind it. And so, you know, if you can get 70 to 80% success, and the other side, there's always some overlap, can get 70 to 80%, you've got a piece of legislation that, again, will stand the test of time. And just for what it's worth, in the Foreign Relations Committee, we never start a process that doesn't start in a bipartisan way. I know, Mark, on the Intel Committee, it's exactly the same way.
Do you agree with that?
I agree, and I think it's even more important. If there's one thing, you know, I've learned, I think maybe one of the reasons we both think this is we've both had careers in business, and the notional idea that we would start and say, I'm going to take ideas from this half of the room, but I'm not going to take any ideas from this half of the room, is just fundamentally foreign to anyone from a business background. And also, you know, politics may be the only endeavor that people have a whole career where they've, you know, maybe had a career where their only success has been stopping things. That is, again, fundamentally different than the business principle where you have to get to yes at some point. And I would also argue that it's, you know, there's no other system in terms of democracies around the world that is so much built like ours in terms of a whole sense of checks and balances. Our system was set up to require that kind of forced compromise. Neither party's got a monopoly on truth. And if you don't have that bipartisanship, one, as Bob said, you don't stand the test of time. But two, you end up in this repeated gridlock where the rest of the world's not standing still. I mean, I think there's one of the valid debates. You know, if we can't find ways to break through this, can this great system we have really stand the test of time? It appears, you know, I was never a fan until recently of parliamentary democracies, but in many ways, at least whoever wins gets to run the show until they get voted out or a government falls. I think our system has worked better for the most part, although in the last, say, 8 or 10 years, it's at least raised questions in my mind.
So how we get so screwed up? I mean, you talked about universal truths, you know. Well, what's going on? I mean, I'd love to hear both of your observations, both from the U.S. Capitol, but also from your home states. What's happening?
Let me start. I think that
Whenever we're together,
he started the first one.
And Mark talks, you know, so.
I think we've turned the keys over to too often turn the keys over to the extremes in both political parties.
But how? There's always been extremes, right?
Well,
how did they get the keys?
I think the way they got the keys was they often bring the most energy. They bring this kind of, somehow we've lost this sense of we as Americans trumping we as red shirt, blue shirt teams. And I would argue, and again, this is something I think that's gotten worse, is that we've ended up concentrating too much power in the respect, and this is not a critique of any respective leader, but of kind of Republican and Democratic respective leaders in both the House and the Senate. Whereas it appeared, I think Bob and I have both sat through many of these settings where, you get some of the old senators, you get old folks say, we always work together. There were more power centers that were distinct, individual chair people were distinct. I think the fact that we concentrate so much into the party leadership now, and then when the party leadership is reinforced by folks on the extremes, we end up with this divide.
When he was talking about party chairs being distinct, he meant you still are one of those people in his mind, I think, in terms of at least a chairman of a committee. Mm-hmm. What is your observation from that sense? I mean, what do you feel being on a committee, chairing a committee that is traditionally bipartisan? Do you agree with that assessment?
I would make some different points, but I think as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, our foreign policy is so important to the safety of our men and women in uniform and all of you that we should constantly ensure that, at least at the shore's edge, partisanship leaves and we work together. And certainly with foreign policy, you want to make sure that the things you're doing absolutely will stand the test of time. And it's just been my nature. Look, I have never been a partisan. But I'll get back to some of some of Mark's comments. Number one, the country's divided, and I know people back home don't like to hear this, but Washington, more fully than people think, reflects the country, and the country is very divided. Secondly, think about the way the whole Congress has changed. Let's just look at the Senate. You used to have people up in the Northeast that were Republicans that were way more liberal than Southern Democrats. And so bipartisanship was easier to come by. Now as you look at the map, it's consolidated and the ideology just doesn't overlap as much. Thirdly, we've basically destroyed the Senate by using the filibuster for everything. I mean, the 60 vote threshold was there to end debate. That's all. Now, the 60 vote threshold, it became, when I first came here, it wasn't quite this way. It was moving this way. But about 2000, I came here in 06, started in 07. Let's say fast forward 2 years later, what happened was all the outside groups started scoring votes, not on the actual vote of the bill, but the cloture vote. And so now both sides, Chuck Schumer's under pressure to block things with 60 votes. Mitch was under pressure. And so we've taken something that was actually supposed to be used to stop debate because it had been debated so long, and now we're using it to stop anything from going ahead. And somehow or another, we've either got to have greater discipline. I mean, it requires you allowing something to go ahead and then voting against it on the 51 vote threshold. Or it's going to require us to change the rules, which I hope doesn't happen.
Neither one you mentioned the media. I'm curious.
Let me take one exception, though. I actually don't believe the country's as divided as, I think there are regional differences, but I think and I think even general, a lot of the enthusiasm for Mr. Trump was around the just get stuff done feeling from a lot of folks. So, again, don't want to start off with Bob and I disagreeing, but
well, neither of you mentioned the media, and I'm curious what you think about these sort of bifurcated or extremely atomized media culture where people are really getting their information only from one news source, and there kind of isn't some universal truths that you alluded to earlier, Senator, that people agree upon. I'm failing, as you know, from the New York Times, so I don't have to worry about that problem. I just let it go. I let the other media worry how they manage these things. But do you have any feelings about that? I mean, you are in your own states. Do you see people in kind of living in an echo chamber, if you will?
So I think anything you watch past 6 o'clock in the evening, it's probably detrimental to your broadness in thinking. It's been very damaging, and unfortunately, so many people that we represent only get their information from one news source. It's just sad. People ask me, where do you get your news, Corker? And I say, well, I get up and I read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Chattanooga Times Free Press, the Tennessean, and Politico. I scan all those things and read many articles at length, and that's how I start my day. And so, I have an idea what he's thinking about things. I mean, and yet most people go through life, and now kids are just getting these headlines, which don't give any news. But the evening cable programs, even though I respect many of the commentators, I really do, I can't watch it. And it's sad to me that our nation it's really entertainment. We know that, right? It's a business model where you basically keep your base excited, riled up, mad at the other side, and if you can build upon that, which means you want to go even more energetic and more extreme in what you're doing, then you make more money. And that, unfortunately, people are viewing as news, but it's not.
I think
it hurts. It hurts. Yeah.
We both grew up in the age where started with just 3 networks, and you had 3 folks, and you basically, trusted Walter Cronkite. And there was a common fact set that you could then argue about, but you didn't question the validity of what they were saying. And one of the things the Russia investigation has been fascinating on so many levels, but one of the most fascinating has been understanding, and I was in the technology business longer than I've been in politics. I'm pro-tech, I'm pro-innovation, but this enormous ecosystem that we've created with social media and an increasing number of people who only receive their news through devices. The average, a couple guys who kind of flipped on folks like Facebook and Google, they make this pitch now where they say, we look at our devices about 150 times a day. And again, we're the only kind of asset where we're looking at the devices and actually giving those companies, every time we look at those devices, more information about us. They're trying to get our kids to look at their devices 250 times a day. And part of the algorithms, which in many ways are not driven necessarily one side or the other, but if you look at a conservative story, to keep you looking again, they've got to produce a more conservative and more outrageous follow-up story. The flip side being the case on the liberal side. So where is that common square that TV or New York Times or Wall Street Journal, they at least, you might have different editorial pages, but you'd start with the same news front. Now we have whole different sets of facts and the ability, unfortunately, for outside forces with a relatively little bit of money and a few number of hackers to manipulate news that comes on any of our devices, no matter how non-factually based. That's only going to get exponentially worse, and it's a huge issue.
Now, you mentioned the probe into the Russia interference into our election, so let's talk about that a little bit more. You and Senator Burr have made a real effort to make that collegial and bipartisan. So do you think that in the end your committee can produce a consensus document?
I think on a lot of issues we'll have consensus. I think we have clear consensus that Russia massively interfered in our elections. I think we'll have clear consensus that they didn't change the votes, but touched 21 state electoral systems, and those systems need to up their game because they'll be back. I think we'll have clear consensus that we've got to figure out a way to sort through, I hope in collaboration with the companies, the social media companies, that they bear some responsibility, at least around disclosure, to kind of be partners with us. I think there remains a huge open question, and one of the things both Richard and I have tried to do is, the question of was there collusion or was there not collusion, I'm keeping an open mind until the very end. We've got more people to talk to. I think if we could come with a bipartisan conclusion, it would be extraordinarily valuable to the country. Having on an issue as important as this, having some split, I think would be very detrimental. But time will tell.
Does it bother you that the President of the United States is using the biggest bully pulpit that exists in the country, basically to look at all the probes into Russia as basically a witch hunt?
Listen, there is not a single member of our intelligence community, including all the people that President Trump has appointed, who have that conclusion. There's not the Facebook, Googles, and Twitters who were reluctant to acknowledge and frankly blew off some of the suggestions at first, have come around. They've reached that conclusion. You talk to the French and about the massive amount of Russian interference in their election cycle. They know about the disinformation campaign and misinformation campaign. And think about it, if you add up the Dutch, they hand counted their ballots because they were afraid of Russian interference. And here's the frightening thing. If you add up all the money that the Russians spent on interfering in our elections, the French elections, the Dutch elections, and double it, it's still less than the cost of one new jet airplane. So this is a great investment in kind of the way I think 21st century conflict will start to play out. And of course it bothers me that the head of our government, because we don't have a whole of government approach to stop it. It could be the Chinese, it could be some other entity going forward on how we prevent that.
So looking at that, in an odd way, do you guys think that President Trump has, in a sense, created some bipartisanship? Obviously, it's pushed a lot of Democrats I'm not done. It's pushed a lot of Democrats farther to the left. Remember when we came back and everyone said, oh, there's going to be a bunch of moderate Democrats who are going to have to vote for the health care bill. You know, it didn't work out that way. Democrats, I think we can all agree, have been pretty unified against the president. But Senator Corker, do you observe that there are areas where Democrats and Republicans are standing together? I know Senator Schatz from Hawaii has made a big deal about how we have to put our policy differences aside and address these issues in the White House. So what do you guys think? Do you think that in that way there is a bipartisan coalition?
I don't know that I want to do the cause and effect necessarily, but the no doubt on the Russia bill. I mean, we had. I mean, it was a big bill, and it did a lot. And we had combined with that the North Korea bill and the Iran bill, a follow-on Iran bill. And we had 98 votes on the floor, 2 negatives. Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul. So that's, you know, that's...
I rest my case.
So,
that's a form of bipartisanship with those guys.
Yeah,
so.
but and look, we've, I don't want to jinx something, but there's numbers of other things that I think will be coming out of the committee that matter, that are going to be very strongly bipartisan. But I just think that, I think what's happening in the Senate is that I've seen the Senate, and I think, Mark, I think your committee is doing the same thing. I know we are in foreign relations. And I watch other committees. I think they're beginning to rise to the occasion. In some ways, and again, I want to be careful about my comments because of some of the things that happened on the last 60 days. I don't mean this in any way to be pejorative. But there isn't really the kind of direction coming out of the White House that typically would come out of a White House. I mean, like on a health care bill, typically a White House would produce what it is they want to pass. Instead, boom. Tax reform, they worked a little more closely together. We did. But I think I see the Senate kind of rising to the occasion. I mean, I've been so proud of the most recent hearings we had. We had a hearing with Tillerson and Mattis on the authorization of use of military force. Outstanding. And we just did one on nuclear issues. Outstanding. And I feel the Senate kind of moving back to the place that I think all of us would like for it to be. We still are going through some big issues right now, and I realize from Mark's standpoint and many standpoints, in an inappropriate way. You know, we're using reconciliation to do really big issues, and you know, that's not the best way to do it. But generally speaking, I see the Senate taking up some of the vacuum that where you might have things directly coming out of the White House, they're not happening, and the Senate's taking the lead.
Well, that was a very understated assessment of the executive branch's management style. You've been a little bit more candid in recent weeks about some of your feelings. You're a good match for the president on Twitter. Has it been good having him out of the country, by the way? I was just curious about that.
Oh, I'm like, you know,
working out. But
you're focusing on Trump and Corker, so I'll let you go on.
well, let me just ask this one question, if I may.
But I got a comment to follow it on here.
I promise. So, in terms of your personal journey, shall we say, I mean, you kind of played an inside-outside game, if you will, when the president was first elected. You didn't hold back on your criticisms of things that they did in the administration, but everyone knows that you were, as I believe, on the short list. I don't know if the president actually asked you to be Secretary of State. That was something that people assumed you wanted to do. We'll get back to that. And you,
not his first rodeo, you know. It's not his first rodeo.
You spoke to the president often. You tried to go over to the White House. You tried to show them what you viewed were the error of their ways. You really tried to do both things.
I did.
And at some point, something seemed to make you throw up your hands and say, forget it. So what can you tell us in behind the scenes of that?
Well, I wanted to save all that for my book.
Well, just like a teaser. Like,
There's a guy here in the
I'll
audience.
cede my time.
A
I don't plan to write a book. I'm just kidding. I haven't taken a note since I've been there.
That's not always a problem for some people.
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think people. So yes, there's been some issues at the top, but Mnuchin was in my office today. Ivanka was in my office Thursday. Pence called me Thursday. Tillerson and I talked a lot. So it's not like, I mean, these are the people I was dealing with anyway. You know, our office is in constant contact with, you know, the National Security Advisor. I'm talking with generals and others. So it's nothing's really stopped. I was, yes. And who knows? I was one of those people that sometimes would get called 4 times a week by the president. I was one of those people that when a big decision was being made and he had his staff sitting around the Oval Office, you know, they would call me on the speakerphone before a big decision was being made. And I'm still someone that is called about big things. But yes, I think what probably began I was critical when I needed to be critical, and I was constructive when I needed to be constructive. Both were meant to be, actually the criticisms they were meant to be constructive. I think where things kind of got a little bit more terse was after the Charlottesville deal. And I don't want to have all this rewritten again and all that. I mean, but the governing model of dividing your country to solidify your base is just not one I can adhere to, okay? So there was something about that episode that turned the volume up a little bit. And actually, you know, my comments were actually aspirational.
The adult daycare part? I don't
No,
know.
that was...
That's an interesting
It had progressed a little bit by that point. But I said, you know, he had not yet demonstrated the stability nor some of the competence necessary to be successful. But the country needed for him to be successful. The world needed for him to be successful. You know, it went about 30 days before we had another meeting. And so we did, and you know, talked it through, and I knew it was going to come up. So I said, Mr. President, this is my quote. I stand by it. And so, you know, that...
Wait, what happened then? And then what did he say?
Well, because I don't ever say what other people say, I'm just going to leave it there. But, you know, obviously the meeting ended fine, and then I don't know what the second series of stuff was. I think, you know, one Sunday morning, the Sunday morning shows were repeating something I'd said. I don't know what it was, but it just it generated a tweet. And I've never tweeted anything out ever like that in my life. And I was coming home from a workout with my wife, getting ready to go to church, and my phone was blowing up, and Todd was calling, who's in the audience, and I don't know, I just typed out the response. Todd says, let's take a 20-minute deep breath on this one. But we felt like it was the right thing to do, and then things kind of, I just think, I don't like that kind of thing. It's not who I am. It's just not the way I conduct myself, but I think that from time to time you have to push back. You cannot let things like that stand.
Senator, I want to get to your relationships, and I want to talk about taxes, but I know that we cut you off, so tell me what you were thinking before.
I don't know, my stuff about, you know, process is going to sound pretty boring now, but
No, it always is. I've been meaning to tell you that for 10 years now.
you know, I'll make it a little, I can't match your tweetage. I would, you know, don't want to agree with him now, but, you know, I do think there are moments in life, you know, in the Foreign Relations Committee, the Intelligence Committee, you know, we have virtual unanimity. We just did a fairly significant bill, didn't get a lot of attention right now, but 9 Democrats, 9 Republicans on some relief for community banks. And Bob and I are, you know, putting the band back together on GSE reform, which is literally one of the most complicated issues I've ever dealt with. But there are things that have, frankly, just pissed me off. You know, as somebody who wanted to be there to get to yes. I mean, you know, you take a You take the healthcare process, which was, for all the bad the Democrats did around Obamacare, the majority this time took that, and it was 10x worse in terms of trying to keep things secret and a process that was only tried to be done with one team. And I left now because I'm actually missing a vote or two, which I can already tell you the results will be. I spent years trying to get the country to focus on the debt and deficit. I was the advocate for the Simpson-Bowles plan. Bob has been as well. And I like to say I work in the only place in America where being a gang member is a good thing. So any kind of gang that's bipartisan, I'm generally part of. And we desperately need tax reform in this country. But this process, where it's done with one team only, there was a great visual contrast. They had President Reagan's proposals from the last time we reformed our tax code held up today, with a big old book, and President Trump's, which was a 3-page flyer. And we're talking about something now that is going to have $10 trillion worth of effect, positive and negative. It's going to add not $1.4 trillion, but it's going to add, based on a group that we both respect, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. It's got all these kind of exploding time bombs in it, gimmicks, $500+ million of, actually $1 billion of these exploding things. Add another $2.2 trillion. And the kind of unwillingness to sit down and say, hey, yeah, we got to find a way to make America competitive on an international basis. And we ought to make our tax code simpler. And that would mean lower corporate rates, and that would mean trying to bring money back. Those are all goals that, sign me up, put me in, coach. I spent years trying to get on the finance committee. And it's been just such a bitter disappointment to see that process not work as well. And so many, not going to mention Bob, but other Republican colleagues who privately come and say, hey, yeah, I know this is not the right way we should do it. It felt like after the healthcare debacle took 2 or 3 times of failing, there was this effort that was, again, I think a lot of Bob's colleague, Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, had, all right, how can we put some fiction together on healthcare? And it seemed to get momentum, and then it slowed down a little bit. Now, my sense is if this effort around finance fails, we ought to be able to do this in a way that makes ourselves more competitive, but doesn't add to our $20 trillion debt that we've got. The lack of fiscal responsibility is such an embarrassment where we work. And again, Bob has been a leader on this as well. But if we could just play back, if you and the press would keep better notes of all the things we say, so when we switch back and forth, whoever's in charge and just play them back to us, we might get better policy. We
take note. Let's talk about, I want to talk about your relationship, but let's just talk about this tax, since you brought it up, this tax deal. The House, I think, is going to vote on that, a package that would raise the debt by well over $1 trillion over 10 years, likely pass without a single Democrat. Curious how you think that could have gone differently. You were complaining about the process. You mentioned the Obamacare process. Super interested to know if you think that is a positive comparison, even though that ended up being a completely partisan product in the end, and how you personally think the tax situation could have gone better.
Well, of course, we're not complete, but look, I think both sides of the aisle have, through the years, begun to take greater and greater advantage of something called reconciliation that was never intended to be what it is. And reconciliation is the process, by the way, where one side of the aisle, if they have control of both sides, can pass with just a 50 plus 1 vote. So it's not good. The rules that define it are very confining, so you can't really end up with a product that works as well as if you did it under what's called regular order. But
where 60 votes are needed.
Yeah, where 60 votes are needed, and you don't have the Byrd rule and all those kind of things that I know I'm speaking Greek to the audience, but there are encumbrances that keep you from doing it in the most elegant and appropriate ways. So look, it's not a good process, and I think we certainly could come up with a better process if we took a longer period of time to make it happen. And so you end up in a situation where you say, look, I wish we were doing it in a different way, but this is the way it's being done. That decision is being made at a different level. So then you come into, do you like the substance or not? I mean, is it substance that you agree with or not? And I think that, you know, for the Republicans, the two things that they felt they were elected on was health care reform and tax reform. And I hope that what's going to occur is that after this process is completed, we can move to a regular order issue where there's not an urgency around dealing with those two issues and moving them out of the way.
The only thing I would add to that, though, is that at least, you know, and unlike others, Bob has actually done a lot of this. The other tenet that I heard from so many of my Republican colleagues when I was taking incoming for being willing to look at entitlement reform and other things was we shouldn't add excessively to our debt. I mean, I work in the only place in America where, you know, if we're only running $600 billion in the red this year, we high-five each other. You know, and we would be bankrupt if interest rates were 200 basis points higher than they are right now. And the notional idea that there's not a way to sort through, and you know, you look again, at some point you do have to have facts. I mean, America's got the worst of both. We got the highest nominal corporate rate, we got the world's most complicated tax code, yet compared to all of our industrial competitors, America ranks in terms of total taxation, even when you add in high taxes in New York, you know, state, local, and federal combined, we're 31st out of 35 nations. So other countries have figured out a way to have a competitive tax code for, if we say we need around business, and still generate the revenues to pay the bills. Yeah. And we have a smaller government and I'm not advocating European-style government at all. So you know, one of the things I hear, and I'd hope Bob and others will think about this, is if this effort doesn't go through, I've heard people say, well, gosh, then, you know, Democrats, you'll crow about it and you know, move on and we'll be at a disadvantage. I mean, I'll say right here in front of everybody, you know, if this effort doesn't go through and you want to find a way to make American business tax competitive, you want to find a way to bring back the $2 trillion plus that's caught overseas, you want to find a way to bring back some modicum of middle-class tax relief, sign me up, but let's do it in a way that's got a little bit of input from both sides and also doesn't add dramatically to the debt. Because, you know, going back to what Bob earlier said, and you know, I'm not going to say Virginia's going to be a precursor of next year, although I hope it will be. But you know, sounds like a biased group here. But
this is a New York Times.
You know, but if it is, you're going to have.
So you're validating the whole deal.
If it is, all you're going to have is you're not going to have any certainty. Because if the Democrats win next year, first thing they'll try to do is undo a one-party only solution on something that's as important as taxes and health. I mean, it is rocket science, but it's not so complicated that there's not a way to recognize that we ought to figure it out together.
And if I could on that, since we've both, in many ways, I feel like I've been one of the biggest deficit hawks
Yes,
in the Senate, voting against really, really popular bills. I'm one of two people against a very, very popular veterans bill because it broke the bank and you know, wasn't even attempted to be paid for. When this bill is completed, if I feel that the growth assumptions are out of line and we are not during this 10-year window going to have a bill that doesn't add to the deficit and hopefully lowers the deficit, I'm not going to vote for it. So I mean, just know that's what.
And
okay. So
I don't know.
Now, and you know, that's why Mnuchin was in my office today. That's why, and I don't mean that. I mean, I'm not out here advocating.
Why don't you go tweet something again?
I'm not advocating for any parochial issues, by the way. I haven't asked for a single thing in this bill. Nothing.
But just to be clear, are you a no at this point?
Well, see, the growth assumptions are, and they're not completed yet, but I actually think it's possible the growth assumptions are going to be in line to where this thing is not going to produce deficits. But let's see, and they've got to prove that out. They've got to prove that out. And one of the things that people have to, when you use the $1.5 trillion number, it's a $1 trillion number because we're syncing up current law to current policy. All of you know that we keep policies in place, and it's like the doc fix. You know, we're always gonna, but we keep kicking the can, and this audience.
I know we can't do doc fix tonight, Senator. That's
Okay,
just gonna
I'm not gonna explain it, but my point is that it's. I think these guys are over demagoguing it, and we're overselling it. And what I want to do is see what's completed, and if I believe it's going to add the deficit, I'm not going to vote for it. If
Are you
I
both
believe
demagoguing?
Two quick points on it.
Okay.
One, show me any time in recent history, modern history, I think any nation, and I don't often quote Alan Greenspan, but I think he said it last week, when you're at virtual full employment and you do a tax cut with borrowed money, good things don't happen. You don't get, you got huge unemployment and you do a tax cut when you don't have substantial debt, you can pump growth. But with a relatively full employment, borrowed money tax cut has not played out in any nation, I would argue, in the last 50 years. And secondly, and some of my Republican colleagues acknowledge as much today, and this is some of the rules that have to get around, is they made some of the things around businesses stuff permanent. And they made some of the things that people really like around middle class run for 5 years. And what the Republican chairman said was, because when I raised the point that would mean cuts in Medicare, he said, we always come back and fix those. And in political speak, that means we've just created this whole new group of what are called extenders. And that's why this group that I have a lot of respect for, that is as bipartisan on the budget as any group I know, has said this bill is not a $1.4 trillion number. It is actually a $2.2 trillion, because you add up the fact that what will happen when that middle class tax cut runs out and people say, well, we got to continue it. Well, let's then tell the people the real cost. And I think, and again, Bob's not on the committee, so he probably hasn't dug into it as much, but this has got a series of exploding policy issues in it that we just ought to be straight with people. If we're going to layer this much on when we've already, both teams have run up $20 trillion in debt already, we ought to at least be straight with you.
Those questions, just for what it's worth, they're being raised in our conference. I'm not on the tax writing committee like you are, but those kinds of issues are being raised by our members too, wanting to close those out. So the process isn't completed. I know it's not going particularly well in the committee itself, but a lot of those questions, I just want you to know, many of us are asking.
So this is a good segue to talk about your relationship. I'm not going to use the word bromance, don't worry. So how did you guys start to be friends and working together?
I came to see him. I got hired. I'd seen Bob with the auto ballot hearings, and he seemed like a smart guy. And I'd gotten hired, and we'd had some mutual friends as well. I said, you got to check this guy out. Like the fact that he'd been a mayor, like the fact that he'd been a business guy. And I think in the first week or so, I went and visited, and we found we had a lot in common.
Were you happy to see him at your doorstep?
This wealthy Democrat.
We both can read a balance sheet, which makes us unique in the Senate.
No, we've had a great time, and look, we sat together at the first presidential. You were elected a presidential year.
Yeah, I was elected with it.
Yeah. So we sat together at the inaugural ceremonies, and believe it or not, we don't really do that much socially.
Shocking. But do you have good, fun stories about each other? I mean, did you have?
Well, there was the one that I think we've used this before, but. We were working on Dodd-Frank, and he doesn't like to recall this, but there was like the section of Dodd-Frank that we worked on, Title I and II, actually got 80 votes. And we're trying to work through this stuff. And our two staff people who had been on the Hill for some time were kind of not following our directions. So we had a famous beer summit where we made our we went with our staffs and made us all have beers together so they could hear from both of us that no, we actually wanted to find a way to get to yes. And it was kind of a little weird that it had to be driven by us to the staff rather than vice versa.
And were they like, I don't want to do it?
And we got to yes.
They were? Did they say, I don't want to do it? Or were they like, okay, we'll do it just for you guys?
No, one of the, I think, as the world has gotten complex, and it really is complex, things are just, and they move so rapidly. Senate staffs are, first of all, they are outstanding. I mean, I work around the finest group of young people in my office that I've ever been around. I love them. And, we have these hideaways in the Capitol that I don't even know where mine is. Because if I've got 5 minutes, I want to go back and meet and talk with my staff. But they drive so much of what happens here because we're all working on so many things. And unless they've got the direction, I think his staff, generally speaking, does now. I know my staff does also. They know we want to get to yes on deals. But at that particular time, these issues it was a pretty big issue and contentious. And I think, there were some personality issues that existed there, some protection issues existing, but that's what it took, and it worked. And again, I think the two sections that we negotiated they will stand the test of time. Yeah.
And we did something, I think, again, that seems common sense, but unfortunately was fairly unique. I think we were both, at least I felt like I had to learn up a lot. I thought I knew something about the financial system, but boy, I had a heck of a lot to learn, and as it was all melting down, we decided we were seeing a lot of the same experts, but rather than them coming to see me and then going to see Bob, we said, as schedule allows, why don't we see them jointly and ask them questions at the same time? So we didn't, we could then hear each other's ideas and push the experts and not get, a secondhand version. And it seems like common sense, but a lot more of that ought to be done.
I'm glad you mentioned the staff. I don't think a lot of people understand just how big a part that is of members' office. They can make or break them. You mentioned gangs before. Do you think there's a potential for a new gang to become together in some form around national security issues or anything?
Gangs have a bad, at this point, I spend so much time with the effort around Simpson Bowles, and again, I think the President Obama should have endorsed it earlier on. But it was kind of like for a while, I was relatively new. I didn't maybe get the joke that the fact that we were spending all this time, I think somewhat the leaders on both sides never thought it was really going to have a real shot. Yet it seemed to be such common sense. So maybe we have to call things differently, but I still believe to this day that if we'd ever had a shot to have that on the floor, we would have gotten 75 votes. I mean, my best day in the Senate was we had 49 senators came. This was right before the first shutdown and so forth. And those of us who were making the pitch, were kind of making the final presentation to all these folks, and presuming that we were kind of throwing in the towel. And people like 2 by 2 started saying, hey, you know what? This is actually in. I'm in. And we had this moment in time where we had the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times editorial board both endorse it. But it was going to, it was going to take on some sacred cows on both sides. On the Democratic side, it was going to acknowledge that the math around our entitlement programs just doesn't work anymore in a society that's aged. And on the Republican side, it realized that the revenue stream we have was never going to pay the bills for the size government we had. And that kind of fundamental moment, I think, boy, oh boy, putting 1 or 2 of those markers on the board why tax reform is important, but just showing in 1 or 2 areas that we can still get things done. I mean, the thing that I worry about the most is we live in the greatest country in the world, but where always there was this, we could take on any problem. I worry at times that there are some in the Senate that somehow feel like it's easier to kick the can, or we don't have the will to take on big problems anymore. And somehow we got to kind of get our mojo back.
The gangs don't work. So, I mean, the gangs don't work. Never have, never will. What Mitch has done, and I've been on plenty of them, okay, but what Mitch, you have to give him some credit for this. He's allowing the committee process to work. I've never gotten a single call from McConnell about anything relative to what we're doing in our committee. We do it, we pass the bill, we line up floor time, and we get it done. And the way for these things to be solved is through the committee process. What might be necessary is not a gang to work on an issue, because the professionalism on the committees, the staffs there too are needed for these things to actually function right, and the expertise by the senators themselves. But what could work in a different way is a group of senators. There are not many left. Okay, there are not many left, but a group of senators in the center right, center left, that on big votes were willing to do things, not on actually producing the legislation itself. But anyway, gangs are not a good way of running a government.
Now, in one of the most sort of intense examples of how divided the country's become, if you look at Roy Moore's situation, Republicans here in town have made it pretty clear that they believe he's an unacceptable choice for the U.S. Senate. Yet back in Alabama, we see many of the Republican Party supporting him, some stating publicly that they would rather vote for him even if the sexual assault allegations, I should say predatory allegations against him are true, because that would be better than voting for a Democrat. What's your observation about how we get to that place in a state?
So you're the 13th New York Times person today to ask me about this topic.
But like that, that way?
No, you
Okay.
did it more elegantly.
Thank you.
So look, I personally thought that before any of these reports came out, before any of them came out, that him in the Senate was a bridge too far, just based on his conduct as a judge and all the things that happened. So I never thought that, I never hoped he would be in the Senate. He ended up being the nominee. The head of the NRSC put out a poll tonight that is our internal polling that shows that he's 9 points down in Alabama. Now, these races, remember what happened in the presidential race, there's a group of people who are very excited about his nomination, and it's going to be a low turnout race, so who knows what actually happens. And I just, every time I'm asked a question about it, look, let's see what happens, first of all, in the election itself. It doesn't appear to me that, all these folks that work on electioneering on our side of the aisle, I'm not one of them, they really, I don't think there's an option yet that works, unless somehow the whole getting of Jeff Sessions to step down as Attorney General, which I hope he will not do, but unless that happens, I just don't see an outcome other than letting the people of Alabama decide between the two candidates that they have.
But I guess I was just asking you more about the mentality of that, oh my gosh, anything's better than a Democrat. Do you think that is generational, or how do you think that we got to that space?
But I'm not sure if that poll's right. I've seen one at 9, I've seen one at 12. Alabama's a very conservative
That he's down
state.
12.
Yeah. Alabama's a very conservative state, but if those numbers, and listen, after 2014, I don't trust any polls.
Right.
Nobody gets the
laugh.
joke.
Don't
I
laugh.
get
Don't
the
laugh.
joke. Nobody else.
It's not that.
Let me tell you,
it's
that
not
was,
funny.
by the
No,
way,
no,
that
don't,
was
don't,
really
don't.
funny. So
That
y'all
was not But I think come December 12th, things play out. Doug Jones is going to win that race. He's the Democratic candidate. He was a prosecutor. He prosecuted some civil rights cases there. And I think, folks in Alabama will surprise us.
Well,
I called a friend, over the weekend that I know well, and he was sharing with me that numbers of people are beginning to say, hey, look, let's go ahead and vote for Doug Jones, this Republican. And that way, it'll just be 3 years, and then there'll be it's very unlikely that a Democrat, it's very unusual for a Democrat to win in Alabama, right? And if that happens, then in 3 years we can, we'll have a Democrat for 3 years, but we can then elect a Republican senator. That's one person. But I think there's obviously numbers of people who are thinking differently today than they were 2 weeks ago.
There have been some provocative articles this week, including by some self-identified liberal journalists who say that they think Bill Clinton kind of paved the path for this at this point, kind of relitigating that time period. Do you agree with that view?
Listen, I think that what Judge Moore done, I think, was absolutely unacceptable. I also think Bill Clinton paid a price for some of his behavior as well.
Do you think that, in retrospect, he should have stepped down from office when those allegations were illuminated?
I'm not Jennifer, good try, but I'm not going to relitigate 1996 or 2012 or, for that matter, 2016. I do think there ought to be, one of the things the Senate did didn't get a lot of fanfare just recently, but we ought to make sure all of us, from members and to staff leaders, have appropriate sexual harassment and other training. And this is not, every institution in the 21st century ought to have that as kind of part of your basic HR code.
You alluded to the elections in your home state. I'd be interested to hear from both of you what lessons you think can be gleaned from that night.
Well, listen, I thought the Democratic candidate, Ralph Northam, would win, but this was the first time post-Trump outside of a single congressional race, and Virginia is a state that, while it's won a few times on the Democratic side, the legislature is still 2-to-1 Republican. I was surprised at the margin. I was hopeful, but would people turn out? And folks turned out in massive numbers, and it just wasn't folks kind of in the blue areas. I mean, this is the first time the Democrats picked up a seat in Southwest Virginia. It was a unique story. It was a young man named Chris Hurst, and his girlfriend, longtime girlfriend, he'd been a TV reporter. She was the TV reporter that was shot on air. And horrible tragedy. And he won in far Southwest Virginia. Now, it included Virginia Tech, but it was showing, I've been a big believer and have fought a lot of folks in my party inside my state that Democrats can compete everywhere, but they got to show up everywhere. And just concentrating in kind of urban and suburban areas is not a good plan. And frankly, there's been a whole lot of rural America that's been left behind by both political parties. And as someone who advocates being competitive everywhere, I think it was a very good sign. And I think a lot of it was obviously due to the president. The thing we heard time and again is this kind of divisiveness, and we being the home of where Charlottesville took place. I was in Southwest Virginia right after that, and I had crowds that I had not had. These were not political events; these were just kind of town hall and other type events. But people were saying, that's not who we are as Virginians, and they bore a lot of umbrage towards the president's comments of kind of equating both sides.
What should Republicans take from that night?
I think Republicans should take that a lot of people in suburban America in particular, but generally speaking, everyone, have not liked what they've seen during the first 10 months of this year. And especially, I mean, the governor's race was one thing, but to see the
15-seat
legislature
House
flip the way that it did, that said something, I think, even more powerful than, sometimes you can have a candidate that just doesn't come across, but when that many people won, I think it's very evident that at whatever level people are watching, they don't like what they've seen the first 10 months.
Can they crawl out? Can Republicans repair at this point?
Well, now you said Republicans. I mean, there's a lot. Sure. I mean, I think if you're going to talk about Republicans in general, I think that the base of the Republican Party probably is disappointed also. It's interesting. The people in the middle have been very disappointed. The people on the left have been very disappointed, and they're very energized. And then the people on the right are disappointed for opposite reasons, and because of the kind of things they had hoped to happen didn't. But let's face it, I mean, without getting too particular here, I think people are responding to tone, the tone in America right now, and there are a few people that are very responsible for that.
And do you think some people might experience a challenge in a primary as a result?
Oh, I don't even know if, you don't know who even runs again, right? You don't know what happens. But look, both parties are divided. The Democrats are able to keep themselves a little bit more together right now because they're in opposition. It's always easier to do that. The Republican Party is going through quite a challenge, and it's some of the extremes are bearing out, and the election was a reaction to things that people are seeing in their lives. I mean, especially in rural Tennessee, you have so many people who have worked hard all of their lives. They went to high school or maybe a couple of years of community college. They've raised their kids. But they're not further along than they're not where they thought they'd be. I mean, 30 years ago, they thought they'd be in a very different place than they are today. So it's created, and both parties have got to figure out how to address that issue, that so many people in our country just do not have the standard of living or are living in a way of life they thought they would. We haven't figured that out, neither party. But it's creating a chasm. And our party, let's face it, the president won by blaming a lot of that on others, right? It was somebody else that caused you to be in this place, and that's not the kind of Republican I am, and that's not the kind of Republican a lot of us are, and so you're going to see challenges, if you will, to quote what Republicans are in the future. And if these guys are in charge again, they're going to have the same kind of challenges taking place.
That could almost sound like a campaign platform. Are you interested in that?
My interest is to finish as strongly as I can over the next 13 months, 13 and a half. I am going to miss what I'm doing tremendously. When I ran, I kind of ran on a missional kind of way. Matter of fact, I ran against Harold Ford, and both of us said to folks in Tennessee that we just couldn't imagine serving more than 2 terms, and yet I'm going to miss it tremendously, and yet what I want to do over the course of the next, miss affecting people, miss doing things that cause people's lives to be better, and so what I want to do over the next, for 13 and a half months is make sure we, our staff, do everything we possibly can to make as much difference as possible, and then take stock of what we do after.
And Senator Warren, you came to the Senate, and your calling card was that you'd be kind of a moderate, pro-business Democrat, strong background in technology. Do you think that's worked out? Do you think
what happened to that?
Yeah, well, he said that, not me.
You know what? Listen. In this continuing, I think I've stayed true to that. But I would echo what Bob has said. The way I got elected governor was the notion that you shouldn't have to leave your hometown in the 21st century to get a good job. And I don't think frankly, either political party's fully figured that out. And I would argue that to a degree right now, both political parties are very caught up in 20th century politics. They've got you got on one side a Republican Party that kind of is unfettered markets. You've got on the other side some on the Democratic side that are in a top-down, one government regulation can fix everything. I did really well in the business sector, but I don't think modern American capitalism is working for enough people. And I think people are giving up on that. And when they give up on that, they go to the extremes. And so I would argue, you need a political philosophy that is geared in the 21st century. Nobody's going to have the same job for 35 years the way my dad did going forward. Yet we have a social contract that was built on the presumption you're going to work in the same job full time. So we ought to change that and have a portable benefit system. We ought to have a tax code that actually invests in human capital the same way it invests in physical capital. You buy a computer, that's an asset. You train a worker, that's a cost. I think the capital markets need to be structured so that I'm not sure the pressures that businesses are under today that we would create the same great companies that were created post-World War II right now, because there's so much focus on short-term quarterly profits over long-term value creation. And the companies are the exceptions, the tech companies. Almost all of those are companies where the founders still control the company. So I would argue, what I would hope the Democrats would do, and I think when they're at their best, is not the old left, right, liberal, conservative, but whoever can be the future party and doesn't simply try to, wistfully look back to some good old days. Because I can tell you, as somebody you get really freaked out when you start thinking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, the things I've seen, again, on the social media side, this rate of change is only exponentially going to go up. And I'm not sure the political debate is keeping touch with that at all.
Okay, I think we're going to take some questions. For those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions, there's mics on either side of the room. I'm also going to take some questions from Facebook Live here and times.com, but I'm just going to give you a one-word answer before I turn to those. Trump runs again. Mark Warner challenges him as a Democrat. Who do you vote for? No, I said one word.
Bob Corker write-in.
Okay. Okay, then. From nytimes.com, Joseph Barnett from California asks, how can there be bipartisanship if the Senate keeps using rules to bypass regular order? We did kind of mention that, but do you think that it can still happen in that context?
Yes, I think, the two big issues that I mentioned are Republicans feel are must-do issues. They don't feel like that they're probably going to be a lot of help on those, want to get them out of the way. I'm not sure that's the case on tax reform. I think it could. But after that, the reconciliation is only available for certain kinds of things. So the other kind of issues, yes, you have to use regular order.
I think if there was one thing the country should have learned from, and I would argue the Democrats did try on certain areas, but if you look at the end of the day where Obamacare and Dodd-Frank were, one party owned them all. You can't do big things in this country without having buy-in from both parties.
Ma'am.
Thank you for this evening. Members of the public sometimes get wind that their representatives in Congress think or feel and say things differently in private than they do in public. And I'm wondering if you feel that that contributes to the disengagement, maybe the disillusionment that the millions of Americans feel with the process, or conversely, do you feel like you guys need less, maybe not as much transparency, not as much sunshine? Your meeting, for example, with the expert in private, where you could ask questions and wrangle with him, sounds a lot like a committee meeting, but just not in front of the cameras, where maybe there's more showmanship to get on the evening news. So I'm wondering where you guys fall on that spectrum between needing more privacy in order to be productive to get things done, or needing more sunshine. And if it's not in that spectrum of private versus public, what solutions do you see? Campaign finance, bringing back the fairness doctrine? What are constructive ways forward?
It's a fair question. You want to take it?
We have briefings all day long. I mean, people are in and out of our office all day long, and out of our staff's office all day long, and I wouldn't want that to change. I mean, being a senator, if you go about it seriously, truly is like getting a PhD, and almost in so many topics, and that's why people like being senators. I mean, it's challenging. But I think as far as the public part goes, I think it's about right. I mean, we don't really talk. Mark and I wouldn't be talking any differently if we were out having an adult beverage. Yeah. But no, I don't think that is the issue at all. The public committee meetings. By the way, we have all kind of classified briefings where we're down in the skiff. No one in the world can listen to what's happening. So I don't think that part is the issue. But I'll let Mark talk about campaign.
I would argue that we're both pretty lucky because we came to these jobs with some financial success behind us. A lot of the men and women we work with, and he's got an hour plus flight, but not the worst. I get to drive home each night, which is a real blessing. But a lot of the men and women we work with, they've worked really hard to get here, and they don't have any independent resources, and you suddenly say you got to go raise $20, $30, $40 million every time you want to get rehired. I think that's crazy. I think you need independent redistricting. I think, people ought to choose their representatives rather than politicians choosing their folks. I do think there is, he said we don't socialize much, but we've gone out often. It's hard to call somebody an SOB after you've talked to them, got to know them in terms of their kids. We both had challenges with kids at times, and we've shared some of those things. That just builds a binding. I do think the fact that I think the Senate's much better than the House in terms of people getting to know each other. Yeah. But the fact that both teams, we're basically here for 3 days a week for the most part, but both teams kind of eat lunches with their own teams. I think all these things, there is a notion of this that if you know someone, it's easier to find some commonality. And I think these kind of things make sense. Now, in terms of arguing for, I'm not arguing for less transparency, but I do think you still need to have a chance to kick back sometimes with folks on the opposite side.
You had a question, sir?
Yep. Thank you guys once again for this talk. It's great. I'm a student, so I will talk a little bit more about the future of things. But Senator Corker, for you, with the Conservative Party, we've seen, or with the Republican Party, we've seen them kind of move away from more of the fiscal responsibility since George Bush kind of, spending, big government spending, and then also now Trump with big government spending. How do I talk, as a moderate Democrat from North Carolina, how do I talk to my more conservative friends into being more fiscal responsible? And then Senator Warner, you kind of inspired me with your more fiscal responsibility talk rather than what we've normally been hearing in the arena nowadays with Bernie Sanders out in the field. But how do I talk to my more left-leaning friends who are in the Democratic Party about fiscal responsibility and what that actually means for the future of the country?
So, look, there's no question that the Medicare Part D component that was passed under President Bush, unpaid for, helped begin part of what's happening. And by the way, he's a friend that I respect and like very much. More so even as time goes by. But no, I don't mean that I didn't like him when he was here. I'm just saying I really like him.
I agree.
Okay?
I agree with you on that, too.
Okay. And then the Katrina thing happened. And I think he felt himself wrongly accused of being not as open-minded, I'll just use that word. And so then even more money began to be spent. And then President Obama came in, and all of a sudden Republicans got religion on spending, right? In other words, and my friends on the other side of the aisle that had religion while Bush was there lost their religion and liked spending money. And I will say that now, and that's generally speaking, not every person, of course. Now what's happened is, look, it's like a party atmosphere, as I've said many times publicly to you and to some of your colleagues here. It's like a party began on Election Day this last year. I don't recognize my side of the aisle as it relates to those issues. So it's unfortunate that it kind of ebbs and flows. You get a lot more fiscally conservative when the other side of the aisle is in office. The problem is for you, a young student in North Carolina, the greatest threat to our nation is not ISIS, it's not North Korea, it's not Russia getting involved in our elections. The greatest threat to our country is the fiscal issue, and almost no one cares about it. Almost no one cares about it. We'll have enough money coming in the next couple of years. The deficit's going to grow over the next couple of years. This is the way it was almost during the entire Obama administration. I don't mean that to be critical. I know we were coming out of a recession. But today, we're going to be at a point where constantly the amount of money we have coming in will only pay for the entitlement programs. That's all. Nothing else. Won't pay for the military, won't pay for education, won't pay for highways, won't pay for anything else. That is our future, is that we only have enough money coming in to pay for the entitlement programs.
Let me give you 2 points. I don't think, and I've had this debate with folks who claim to be super progressive. I think there's nothing progressive about refusing to acknowledge the math around some of the entitlement programs. I think Social Security and Medicare are great programs. But, you know, when I was your age, there were 15 people working for every one person on retirement. Today, there are 3 people working for every one person on retirement. Don't blame us, blame the doctors. Y'all are living longer. But there's, you know, that notion, and Bob has said this, if entitlements squeeze out everything else, I'll tell you America's business plan right now, and this was even frankly at the end of Obama, and it's gotten worse with Trump, is for every dollar you send Uncle Sam, we're spending about 7 cents on education, infrastructure, and R&D. Now, as a business guy, I'd never invest in a business that spent less than 10% of its revenues on its workforce, plant, and equipment and staying ahead of the competition. That is a bad business plan. And the only way you're going to relieve that, unless you raise taxes beyond what people would ever expect, is fiscally responsibility and also realize government still needs to make those investments.
Sir, I think you get the last question, so please make it good.
So this is a campaign finance related question. This building is dedicated in some ways to the Freedom of Information Act, and you guys in Congress frequently praise transparency in government. If you had to publish your daily schedules showing the amount of hours spent fundraising at dinners or in these call log centers, would that embarrassment be enough to cause you to change the way campaigns are financed and look more closely at citizen or publicly funded campaigns? If you had to reveal your schedule, your call logs, your visitor logs, the way that all the secretaries of the departments have to do under FOIA, the way the president has to do under the Presidential Records Act, but you guys made yourselves exempt.
Yeah, listen, probably I'm lucky I don't do as much of it as many of the colleagues, because I've got, again, and there shouldn't be a prerequisite that you've got to come to this job having financial security. That I think is also opposite. So yeah, I think it would make a difference.
So I think that maybe on the House side it's a bigger issue than it is on ours. Just for what it's worth, it would not embarrass me, especially right now. I'm not free.
Well, that would be weird.
But even before, honestly, I don't think between Mark and I, maybe
lucky.
we're in a little bit
We're
different
lucky.
position, but no, I'd be glad to let everybody know how much time I spent raising money compared to all the screaming hours I spend doing other things and going to the Middle East and all those kind of things. So it would not embarrass me in any way, but I get your point. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, I think that is about a conclusion of our program. First, I want to thank the senators so much. They're so busy. It was a fantastic conversation. You can see the people who lined up to talk. It was great interest. I thank our audience very much, and live and here, especially a special nod to our New York Times subscribers. Thank you for your support of our journalism and for being here. And check nytimes.com for more live events here in Washington next year. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.